In today's video, I'm sharing 5 powerful ways to heal yourself from sibling abuse. So in this video, we're going to talk about what is sibling abuse, what causes it, and ways you can actually heal yourself from it. But if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So what is the difference between normal sibling conflict and sibling abuse? In normal sibling conflict, there is no intention of hurting the other person. Whereas in sibling abuse, it's a repeated pattern of intentionally harming the other sibling. This can often start out with teasing, ridiculing, belittling a sibling, or hitting them, or being the object of their rage. These are some examples of sibling abuse. And this is actually the most common form of abuse, but parents tend to minimize and deny it altogether because they don't believe it's actually happening. They may label it as sibling rivalry, or, oh, they're just teasing each other. But really, there is such a thing as sibling abuse. And if this is you, say me too in the comments. You're not alone. This video is going to help. So what causes sibling abuse? The first thing is any type of parental neglect or abuse will definitely be a factor. So in terms of parents neglecting their children, this may be intentional or unintentional. Maybe the parents had to work a lot and left the older sibling to take care of the younger ones. Unfortunately, this sets up a lot of stress for the child because they have to fend for themselves, which is a ripe environment for abuse because there's very little supervision. The older or abusive sibling is often acting out of their own unmet needs. So they will mimic the parents' abusive behavior towards their younger siblings. Another factor that causes sibling abuse is parental favoritism, where one sibling is favored greatly over another. This can create a lot of jealousy and resentment between the siblings that can lead to abuse later. And these issues are not being dealt with within the family because often sibling abuse happens in secret. The parents may not ever witness it themselves, but even when they're told about the abuse by the child, often the parent will minimize it and ignore it and say, oh, that's not happening, because they may not know how to deal with it, or they just don't have the coping skills to deal with it effectively. Another factor that creates sibling abuse is older siblings having to take care of younger siblings. This is a huge responsibility that we often don't realize until we look back on it years later. Because if a 12-year-old is raising children, they're way too young to have that level of responsibility. And it also sets the child up not only to resent their younger siblings, but also feel like they've lost their own childhood because they had to grow up too early because they had to take care of their younger siblings. This could happen if the parents have to work, or maybe one parent has passed away and there's just way too much work for one parent to do. So sometimes this is unintentional, but when a sibling has to be responsible for their younger siblings most of the time and they don't get a break, that can really lead to sibling abuse. Another factor in sibling abuse is a significant age difference. Usually the abusive sibling is quite older and takes on a more dominant role. Another factor in sibling abuse is when the abusive sibling is physically or emotionally stronger than their siblings. This makes it easier for them to dominate their younger brothers and sisters. And couple that with a lack of supervision, and the likelihood of abuse goes up. Now, another aspect I want to talk about is how sibling abuse actually can create codependency in that abused sibling. Because when we're abused as children, we feel like we don't have a voice. It's very easy to struggle with low self-esteem and not trusting ourselves. And often when there's sibling abuse, even when the child does speak up, the parents don't necessarily believe that sibling. And if the abusive sibling is really good at gaslighting and pointing the finger at the younger sibling, then that's going to complicate it even more. And it's going to make the abused sibling really feel isolated and alone. And this is ripe for codependency to develop, because when you feel helpless, when you feel like you don't have a sense of self and that you're not believed, you start to question who you are. And you end up losing that identity that you were starting to form as a child. And those are seeds for codependency. Often this leads to not being able to speak up or advocate for yourself, or you don't know what you want or need. And boundaries are super scary because you automatically assume that the other person is going to get upset because your older sibling probably got abusive when you tried to say no or set boundaries with them. Another aspect of how codependency can develop with sibling abuse is that the abused child often develops people-pleasing behaviors in order to try to avoid the abuse. So they will try to please their older sibling in hopes of being able to have a better relationship and avoid their anger. They also tend to become the chameleon, so they change who they are depending on who they're with. And often this won't work in abusive sibling relationships because the abusive sibling is so frustrated they don't have another outlet. So they target their sibling or younger siblings because the parents aren't intervening. So how does experiencing sibling abuse affect us in later life? It majorly impacts our ability to make friends as kids. Because when you think about it, our first peer relationships are with our siblings. So when those are dysfunctional and even feel unsafe, then we're not going to necessarily learn the proper social skills to go and make friends in school. In fact, it's going to work against us because you may end up fearing other kids or feeling like the outcast because you don't have the confidence to play with other kids, or feel like you can stand up for yourself or express an opinion because maybe you were beaten up over that at home. We also may develop addictions, especially to food, because as children, we need coping mechanisms. And if nobody is there to help protect us, then often food is the easiest substance for a child to get. Also, alcohol and drugs can happen because that's also a way for them to cope. We also may attract toxic or unkind people in our relationships later in life because our family relationships tend to create the template we have for future adult relationships. So we might attract the same type of individual that was abusive to us, not because we want to, but because it's familiar. So how can you start healing from sibling abuse? The first thing is to start acknowledging the feelings. Often these feelings are buried for years because we don't typically feel comfortable sharing them with family and friends. Usually we feel like it was our fault because if we grew up seeing our friends play with their siblings and we didn't, we may feel even more isolated and alone. So we might tend to blame ourselves for that. So the first step in healing from sibling abuse is to really let yourself start to name it and feel it. And this is where joining a peer support group like Al-Anon or Adult Children of Alcoholics can be very, very helpful, because what you want to start doing is start sharing these stories in a safe place where you're going to be heard and you're not going to be given any direct advice unless it's from a counselor. Another step for healing from sibling abuse is figuring out what your boundaries are with them now. So for instance, how much time do you want to spend with them? Is there any part of that relationship that you think is salvageable? Or are they so toxic and demeaning to you that you really want nothing to do with them? And I want you to consider this for a while. Don't just automatically answer it, because sometimes we can answer out of that abused child that was really hurt. But sometimes there are certain things about that other person we can salvage and still have a connection with our sibling. For instance, maybe you have a hobby or something in common that can really preserve that connection. But if you don't feel emotionally safe, then that's going to be a lot less of a connection than you normally would with someone that you feel safe with. Common boundaries that come up might be physical space. You might need a lot of space when you're in the room with your sibling, because if they've been abusive, especially if it's been physical, you're going to want plenty of room so that you can feel safe. Another common boundary is an emotional boundary, where if they start name calling you or teasing you or doing any of those abusive behaviors again, you may need to practice detachment and leave the room. Ideally, if you can say, you know what, that really hurts, I'm going to go now, and put words to it, that's ideal. But that's up to you, because if the sibling is really toxic and you don't feel safe sharing anything, then I would just vote with your feet and leave the room. That's probably the best thing you can do to take care of yourself. Another way to heal from sibling abuse is to get some therapy. This is super important because it's a type of abuse that tends to have a lot of shame in it, because it's not something that people talk about. And it's probably not something your parents validated for you. So there's a double whammy there. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about what kind of therapist would feel safe to you. Because usually the work is going to be around self-esteem, maybe connecting to your inner child, learning relationship skills, and really starting to process what happened to you in a safe place. Because while support groups are great, sometimes we need a professional to help us work through that trauma. Now, another step for how to heal from sibling abuse is consider whether or not you want to bring it up to that sibling. And what I mean by that is I don't want you to do it in hopes of getting an apology or in hopes of getting validated. Because most likely, if the person's still abusive, you're not going to get that. But often, if we speak up about what happened and share our truth by simply saying something like, I just need to let you know that what happened when we were kids was really painful for me and I'm still dealing with it. And I just want to let you know that because I want you to know how I really feel. Talking directly to a sibling can do one very important thing. It can shift the dynamic from feeling like a child in their presence to becoming the adult. Because when we speak our truth, we feel like we're starting to protect ourselves. And that's part of healing from sibling abuse, is to be our own advocate. Often I recommend doing this by phone, not in person, because if there's a safety issue, the phone is going to give you a much better buffer of protection that you're going to need when you talk to your abusive sibling. The next way to heal sibling abuse is to consider changing the story a bit. And what I mean by that is you're not going to minimize or deny what happened to you. But what I want you to do is try to see if you can tell a different version of it. And this often happens later in your healing process, where instead of telling the victim story about everything that was done to you, even though that was true, and in the beginning that's a really important part of the process, eventually what I want you to do is I want you to tell it more from an adult's point of view, from victim to victor. Because in that adult point of view, you might include some factors of, you know what, I get why this happened because our parents were super dysfunctional or we were left alone a lot. Telling a different aspect of the story might give you a different perspective, and that too can be healing. Because while we can't change the abuse that happened to us as kids, we can look at it differently. And I find in my own recovery, that's been a really significant part of my progress. Because in telling the story from a more adult point of view, there can be more healing. Now, your next step is I want you to go watch my video on how to heal your inner child, because that's also part of this work. Thanks so much.